Hi everyone, welcome to the season finale of Science in a Post-Truth World. In his short reflection, written a few years prior to the Second World War, John Dewey presents a vision of science and technology that should be familiar to all of us. Science and technology create the possibility of ease and security for all, what Dewey calls the, quote, potentiality of plenty. It's impossible to understand science and technology's role in society, the cultural images that shape it, the authority with which it is imbued, the resources committed to it, the large-scale ordering of our societies towards scientific pursuits without considering this vision. He is, in various ways, articulating a version of the Enlightenment project. A project, as we've seen in our discussions of post-truth, that still has its fervent defenders. For Dewey, writing in 1934, this project had yet to be realized. Feinberg, while critical of classical conceptions of enlightenment, also believes in the emancipatory potential of science and technology. But like Dewey, he also thinks that this potential still has not been realized. In the 83-year interim, there were innumerable other thinkers who confronted the same problem. If science and technology have the potential to be emancipatory, why have they not yet reached this potential? The issues surrounding the notion of post-truth can help us answer this question. As we have seen, the urge to see our fragmented and polarized world as the fallout of an abandonment of truth is to imagine that there is some epistemology that can serve as the basis for achieving consensus and unity, that there is some form of truth with the power to compel many different actors to abide by it. In other words, talk of post-truth is a proxy for laying out conceptions of rationality. And in order for rationality to be able to bridge epistemic divides, it is supposed to be universal. Universality is partly a philosophical and partly an emotional longing, but universality would also seem to solve the problem of social and political fragmentation. The truths demonstrated by science seem to be exactly the kinds up to this task. Science has standardized methods, it produces universal laws, it exemplifies objectivity. It seems to transcend time and place. Science, thus, presents much more than a totality of facts and useful conceptual tools. It presents a model of rationality. While Dewey's conception of the roles of science and its relationship to moral responsibilities and social consequences was complex, he advanced essentially this viewpoint. The quote-unquote scientific mindset, as he calls it, was, in his words, the supreme intellectual obligation. Now, the qualities that characterize this mindset for Dewey were quite broad. He called for open-mindedness and self-criticism. But as Feinberg argues, relaying the insights of both critical theory and STS, what has now come to be viewed as a scientific mindset is much more narrowly defined. It is a form of rationality that is determined by the very particular forms that our scientific inquiries and technical applications have taken in the 20th and 21st centuries. Science and technology have come to be defined by metrics and standards of optimization, efficiency, productivity, and output. A key point that Feinberg makes is that this particular manifestation of science and technology is rational. It's just a particular form of rationality. If rationality, like truth, is defined by its pragmatic characteristics, then there is no inherent universal Platonic form of rationality, but instead many different ways we could rationalize technoscience. And since the social and technical are co-produced, we cannot rationalize one system without rationalizing the other. This is why Feinberg talks of socio-technical rationality. Neither is primary. They are part of a strange loop that is mutually reinforcing. We structure our societies so we can carry out scientific and technological projects in particular ways, and our society is structured by this knowledge through technological infrastructure. So metrics of efficiency and optimization define the social just as much as the technical. Any system of rationalization defines certain kinds of propensities. tendencies towards certain outcomes. In other words, its potential. Dewey thought science failed to meet its potential. In his view, science and technology offered a promise that was going unfulfilled because of languishing social and political will. Despite his complex understanding of the relationship between the social and the scientific, he iterated a dichotomy that is still so common. Politics stands in the way of science. Dewey recognized that ultimately science could not bypass politics. The solution to science's unfulfilled potential was to make politics a part of science, to imbue it with the quote-unquote scientific mindset. While Feinberg also points to failures of socio-technical rationality, they're not a result of lagging political institutions that have failed to become scientific. In Feinberg's view, carrying on the insights of critical theory, our social and political systems are functioning as they have been designed to. They're not failing to live up to their potential, they are producing the kinds of outcomes that their dominant architects have sought. So this might partly answer the question of why science and technology have not lived up to their emancipatory promise. They have not been oriented towards this end. Of course, there are active debates about this precise question. Do our socio-technical systems maximize freedom or amplify existing forms of disenfranchisement? An unsatisfactory but perhaps accurate answer is that they do both. It just depends on how a particular group or individual is located within the system. Feinberg argues that, in any case, this question is impossible to answer without a view of power relations, which are defined in part by scientific knowledge and its technical applications. Which is to say that science and technology are forms of power in themselves. But this doesn't mean that our socio-technical systems have been comprehensively designed to perfectly fulfill some ends and not others. Simply that many parts of these systems, especially large infrastructures like those undergirding energy and transportation regimes, are built to fulfill certain aims and interests. Over time, their functionalization becomes increasingly oriented towards these interests. Not because anyone has total control over the systems, but because of a series of adaptations whereby arrangements that fulfill dominant interests become further concretized, while those that undermine these interests are neglected or actively dismantled. And as Feinberg points out, despite their design, these systems still yield unintended consequences and carry out various functions that are incidental to the larger purposes to which they are oriented. Comparing Dewey's optimistic view of the unfulfilled potential of science and technology to Feinberg's more critical view of the built-in tendencies of our socio-technical systems points to a deep paradox that characterizes the dynamics of technoscience. Feinberg argues that our conceptions of science and technology are marked by a conflicting duality of infinitude and finitude. The former is what characterizes the association of science and technology with progress. In this view, science and its technological applications are limitless. We can continuously learn more about the world and use that knowledge to create ever more efficient and productive technologies. And via these technologies, as a society, we can continue the project of social progress. This is very simply captured in the fundamental measure of our societies: growth. Our socio-technical systems are oriented towards this goal: continued and limitless growth. But on the other side of the paradox is the conception of science that defines our limits. These are the scientific truths that reflect the inherent nature of the universe, its fundamental laws, and its immutable structure. This is the science that tells us we can't jump out of windows. This is the hardness of objective reality that is supposed to put all of these troublesome relativists in their place. As I've argued previously, in my view, relativism has always been an exaggerated threat. Those that worry about it most loudly paint a picture of a dystopian world where what counts as knowledge is entirely arbitrary, where people are apparently jumping out of windows at random. But they invariably fail to grapple with the paradox. It is the instrumental rationality of our prevailing conceptions of science and technology as a means to infinite possibilities, the conceptions that give science its authority, that yields the diversity of incompatible political projects. Technologies can be mobilized towards innumerable different ends. Technologies themselves don't just have interpretive flexibility, they create it, as the endless permutations of our digital technologies reveal. Moreover, as we've discussed, deep conflicts about knowledge claims, as in the case of climate change or vaccine safety or any other technoscientific controversy, are not marked by an abandonment of rationality, but conflicting rationalizations, even conflicting claims to scientific truth. If our society understands science and technology as primarily forms of power to be recruited to fulfill whatever ends we desire, it is unclear how this form of technoscientific rationality could serve as the basis to set limits on our political projects. But as Feenberg observes, within this framework of infinite possibilities, our prevailing forms of socio-technical rationality do set limits. The paradox is manifold. Indeed, it is precisely because of the preoccupation with infinitude that these limits function so insidiously. For to achieve infinitude, especially at an ever-increasing pace, our socio-technical rationality has become increasingly narrow, which points to yet another layer of the paradox. The ostensible universality of science stems not from its breadth or diversity, but because of the narrow scope of functions to which our socio-technical rationality is oriented. Of course, it does exhibit an expansiveness in the range of cases to which it can be put. Our technologies are increasingly powerful. They can be imposed. But that we can use these technologies to turn all of nature into raw resources, or rationalize our social systems in ways that turn all humans into consumers, doesn't mean that nature is inherently and universally a resource any more that people are inherently and universally consumers. A common term to denote narrow forms of scientific rationality is scientism, the view that all inquiries, all knowledge claims, rationality itself should take on the form of the natural sciences. Do we aspire to instill all of society with the scientific mindset? The question, of course, is exactly what that mindset entails. Is the mindset expansive, open, and critical, like Dewey had hoped? Or is the mindset narrow? Those who championed technocracy, writing a few years after Dewey, also dreamed of potentialities and pushed for the widespread adoption of their version of the scientific mindset. But it took a different form. In many ways, the ghost of technocracy still haunts us in the view that our social problems can be rationalized in the same way as our technical problems, or that social problems fundamentally require technical solutions. This involves a narrowing of the scope of data and methods of analysis that are employed. In other words, reductionism. We expect our social world to be calculable in the same way as our technical world. This orients us towards certain kinds of questions, certain kinds of problematizations, certain kinds of measurement. Indeed, it makes us sensitive to certain kinds of phenomena and not others. But there are problems that fall at or outside the limits of this rational framework. And since the system isn't oriented towards detecting or solving these problems, they go un- or under-addressed. As Feenberg notes, this form of socio-technical rationality is not absolute. It reaches its limits in the form of protests, social unrest, and various environmental and health risks that put people, even those most committed to the rationality of the system, in jeopardy. Feenberg argues that this can't go on indefinitely. He observes that at the margins of our socio-technical systems, we find disenchantment with science and technology. Such disenchantment is not necessarily coherent, as in the case of the backlash against 5G wireless. And as Blackburn pointed out, those who reject modern medicine, for example, in favor of naturopathic remedies with perhaps dubious efficacy, nonetheless avail themselves of a multitude of other technological benefits. Feenberg argues that this disenchantment is entirely understandable. It occurs at the blind spot in our socio-technical systems where rationalization runs up against the everyday lived experience of those who are being rationalized into that system. The disenchanted are often those experiencing the paradox, those who have been sold the promise of the potentiality of plenty, but instead find, in Dewey's words, quote, want, insecurity, and suffering. A pragmatic view helps us understand this disenchantment. Take, again, the example of modern medicine. If knowledge is supposed to be useful, but the predominant forms of medical rationalization, pharmaceuticals and reactive therapies which take chronic diseases for granted, puts these purported benefits of science out of financial reach for many people or lead to devastating consequences, like the opioid crisis in the United States, then in which sense can this knowledge be said to work? While Feenberg is sympathetic to the circumstances that lead to this disenchantment, the alternatives are often no better. Indeed, the alternatives are often not alternatives at all. They're quickly subsumed and rationalized into the dominant socio-technical system. So-called alternative medicine becomes a multi-billion-dollar industry in itself, oriented around habitual and increasing consumption and dictated by the same norms of novelty as any other consumer industry. And of course, it recruits the authority of science when it's useful. For Feenberg, there's no denying that science and technology have conferred enormous benefits on humanity. There's no doubting that science, at its best, gives us accurate and powerful models of the world. Science clearly yields much useful knowledge. But alongside these benefits, science and technology have functions that are not emancipatory. Indeed, they are the opposite. Science and technology can be leveraged to reinforce existing power structures and amplify the disparities within them. In various geopolitical contexts, the power of an increasingly narrow set of actors is being consolidated, leading to greater inequality. Socio-technical rationality can serve this function just as effectively as an emancipatory one. And indeed, Feenberg suggests that in highly developed socio-technical systems, consolidating power is their dominant orientation. That the least empowered also enjoy the benefits of science and technology functions to disguise this dynamic. Moreover, Feenberg argues that technoscience is failing in another crucial regard. Our socio-technical systems are marked by yet another paradox. While so much of science and technology is meant to reduce risks in the form of advanced medical knowledge and techniques, better nutrition, safer abodes and means of transportation, the systems that allow for these advancements produce risks in and of themselves. The overall hope is that these dueling tendencies are balanced in such a way that risk overall is reduced. But Feenberg argues that we seem to be reaching the point where the creation of new risks outweighs the reduction of old ones. This dilemma is exemplified by the problem of climate change. As I've discussed previously, climate change in itself is a product of our socio-technical rationality. That human beings can affect the climate on such a scale is only possible via the power of our science and technology. But our ability to model and understand these effects is also only possible via those same means, the paradox of pursuing infinite growth and revealing our finite limits. For Feenberg, that this dilemma has reached this point means there's no turning back. We cannot escape the risks by return to nature. We cannot be Henry Thoreau in the woods. And such an impulse would mean turning our backs on the immense benefits that science and technology can offer. In other words, Feenberg is unwilling to abandon the project of an emancipatory rationality. Science and technology still offer the promise of a potentiality of plenty, not in the profligate pursuit of luxuries, but in offering the means to a fulfilling life, not only materially, but spiritually, emotionally, and intellectually. Even if a simplistic life, oriented towards sustainability and defined by nature's limits, is what we seek, science and technology could help us achieve this. And it needs to be iterated that there still remains, many decades after Dewey's exhortations, hundreds of millions of people on this planet afflicted by, quote, want, insecurity, and suffering. To alleviate this, we have to reorient our socio-technical systems. So there's still room for something like Dewey's scientific mindset. But the question remains, what should characterize this mindset? Dewey defines it as an attitude of, quote, open-mindedness, intellectual integrity, observation, and interest in testing one's opinions and beliefs. What might we add to this? Well, let's reflect on our course and see what answers our inquiries might provide. If we go back to where we started with Blackburn, we find some pragmatist insights. Blackburn emphasized the importance of dealing with knowledge-making in specific contexts of application, the piecemeal ways people go about making inquiries about the world, rather than trying to establish some abstract conception of the meaning of truth. In so doing, we might find answers to why many are disenchanted with the prevailing orientations of science and technology. If it is the case that there has been a widespread decline in public esteem for experts, one of the prevailing concerns in discussions of post-truth, maybe this is not flight from rationality, but a pursuit of alternative forms of rationality. Perhaps this is our first addendum to Dewey's scientific mindset. Such a mindset has to be sensitive to the specific contexts in which knowledge is being put to use. These pragmatist questions, further refined by Rorty, highlight the ever-present practical justification for science and technology. If the ultimate defense of our forms of science and technology is that they work, then the question must be, in what sense do they work? If the risks they create outweigh the benefits, then perhaps they don't work. From Jasanoff and Simmet, we receive the insight that this question only makes sense with a view to power. It's not only do they work, but for whom do they work? Every knowledge-making enterprise must confront this question. For whom is this knowledge made and for what purpose? Similarly, if science and technology are about finding limits and pushing limits, who is defining those limits? Risks are not uniformly felt. A benefit for one is a risk for another. Without attending to such questions, science and technology can't be accountable. So here we might find another necessary characteristic of any scientific mindset: accountability. Every work we've explored in this course has encouraged us to expand our conception of what constitutes rationality. Technical knowledge in itself cannot, as technocrats hoped, be the primary means of pursuing our ends. Our rationality needs to become more expansive, incorporate different kinds of logics, and diverse kinds of knowledge. In the science versus politics dichotomy, politics comes to represent irrationality, arbitrarily subjective desires, as if politics was inherently relativistic. But from Turner, we see that politics is deeply rational. No one advances a politics arbitrarily. We provide reasons for our political visions. We don't simply declare them. Blackburn points to the hypocrisy of those who use technologies but deny the rationality of scientific knowledge. He argues that this is inconsistent and that any rational mindset should be concerned with coherency. I too think coherency matters. One thing Feenberg shows us is that our prevailing forms of socio-technical rationality are incoherent, defined by paradoxes that ultimately undermine the benefits rationality is meant to offer. But I am less interested in epistemological coherence as Blackburn, and more interested in the kind of coherence that a philosopher like Kitcher seeks. A coherence of facts and values, a coherent coordination of our knowledge-making and political visions. As Feenberg says, values are the facts of the future. This presents yet another addition to the scientific mindset, an understanding that science is inextricably political and value-laden. Dewey argues that science must involve an inclination towards, quote, testing one's opinions and beliefs. And arguably, science does this in many regards. The apparatuses of scientific knowledge-making are oriented towards the rigorous testing of others' knowledge claims. But as our philosophical forays have revealed, from Blackburn to Deere to Rorty, any system of making and testing knowledge rests on a set of assumptions. And those assumptions typically lay outside the system of testing. Via Collins, Evans, and Weinel, we find a conception of STS that entails testing the very assumptions of scientific knowledge-making. It is often forgotten that science and technology studies, or at least its precursors in the sociology of scientific knowledge, was originally conceived of as a science of science. Through its naturalistic orientation towards knowledge and truth, it aimed to turn the very means of scientific analysis on science itself. In other words, it was a reflexive form of knowledge-making. As we've seen throughout this course, a concern for reflexivity is overarching. The course's dominant themes, that all truth claims are political, embedded in broader socio-technical systems, carrying out various political projects. That science and technology are always value-laden, not value-free. That we can only understand knowledge-making practices and technological applications in specific social and historical contexts. That ideas like facts, objectivity, and truth are not timeless nor universal, but have histories that could have unfolded differently. All of these perspectives are reflexive. They are achieved through turning inquiry on inquiry itself, by pushing critical analysis to greater and greater depths, aimed at revealing the assumptions that underlay our conceptions of science, truth, and rationality. If science does have an orientation towards testing its own assertions, this can simply be viewed as an extension of that test. If science is about finding limits, the limits of our knowledge, the limits of our models and explanations, finding the point where they cease to be useful, where they encounter some situation where they no longer hold, then shouldn't we also apply that critical attitude to science itself in order to find where its limits lie? Some philosophers, like Blackburn, think that this skeptical attitude can go too far. This concern accounts for the longevity of the postmodern boogeyman, who in the time of Dewey was called the idealist. The fear is that you can be so skeptical, so doubtful, that the result is chaos. But if we take STS's empirical orientation to look at beliefs as they actually work in the world and not as abstract philosophical problems, we find no empirical support for such a worry. There is simply no tangible group of people who act wholly without reason. And in any case, such a deep skepticism should not lead to the conclusion that there are no grounds for action and thus acting randomly and arbitrarily is justified, but rather it should prompt realization that certain ways of knowing and acting in the world that we take for granted might not be justified. And as we have discussed in our course, a phenomenon that marks our post-truth world is the ever-increasing complexity that we find in it. Again, the paradox, the socio-technical rationality that is supposed to reveal ever more objective truths is creating conditions that we are unable to make sense of. As Dewey wrote 83 years ago, quote, "The consequences of science have transformed life in ways that have created social problems of such vastness and complexity that the human mind stands bewildered. Intellect is at present subdued by the results of its own intellectual victories." One outcome of a reflexive attitude could simply be that we slow down a bit, that we get a little bit more space and time to get a handle on all the vast and complex problems before we create new ones. In the spirit of pragmatism, this seems eminently useful. If knowledge making is meant to be practical, there's a very good pragmatic case to be made for reflexivity. It would solve all sorts of problems, most optimistically, our increasing epistemic and political fragmentation. All proposals for a shared system of socio-technical rationality try to hone in on some grounds by which this rationality could be made, for all intents and purposes, universal. What might serve as the basis for a means of deliberation that all human beings could participate in? We are all bound to specific contexts. Our situatedness and our particular values define the knowledge we find useful. But we all share this in common. Our understandings of the world are all marked by partiality, taken for granted assumptions, and ultimately ignorance. Could this be the way out of our post-truth world? Could this be the basis for a more humble, more cooperative, and ultimately more emancipatory rationality? I think so. A deep reflexivity is fundamental to any scientific mindset deserving of this name. But I could be wrong. I just ask that you reflect on it.